A hand hovers over a diagram of bronze gears, torchlight sliding across two piles below. One will be carried up into the world. The other will be let go. The hand belongs to no name we will ever know. It moves in a sealed chamber cut into the rock beneath the halls of a great library, deciding what the future will be allowed to remember. One scroll copied and carried up, the other never recopied and gone from the world for good. This room held knowledge the ancient world was never supposed to touch this early. So what would you have kept? We will walk from that legend to the evidence and find something stranger than the myth itself. But to reach that hand, the story has to jump back 3 centuries to the city where all of it begins. Alexandria was founded in the early 3rd century before our era, under the dynasty that ruled Egypt after Alexander. That is nearly 23 centuries ago, older than most nations alive today can imagine being. The library rose at its heart, and beneath the halls, so the legend runs, a second archive waited. Not scrolls this time, but strange machines. Not poems, but diagrams of gears, drawings of devices with no business existing in that age. And access was guarded. The story insists on this. A chosen few, vetted and sworn, the only ones ever allowed near the deeper stacks. Doors sealed behind them. Outsiders turned away at the threshold. That is the legend at full voltage. A hidden vault of impossible science, generations ahead of its time. A handful of quiet keepers kept it from the world. It is a good story. It has been told for a very long time, growing bolder with each retelling. But here is the thing about a story told for 2,000 years. As far as the record shows, nobody ever set it beside a real object and asked whether it was true. That is about to change, for good. Picture a scholar arriving at the harbor with a letter of introduction folded in his robe. He has crossed the sea for a single privilege, to be let inside. So a scholar who reached its gates entered the museon, the research house attached to the library. A span so vast it stops feeling like history and starts feeling like legend. And legend is exactly what grew here, filling every gap. The story its believers tell is simple, seductive, and almost too neat. Alexandria was antiquity's secret incubator, a city where kings hoarded science generations ahead of its age. Attached to the library stood the museon, a state-funded research institute where scholars were housed and paid only to think. It was the closest the ancient world ever came to a university. The best minds came running. Among them worked the mathematician whose textbook would shape geometry for the next 2,000 years. But the legend needed a locked door, so the retellings built one. And a chosen few, the retellings insist, were the only ones ever let near the diagrams that mattered. Where does that certainty come from? Not from any object anyone can hold. It comes from ancient rumor, from half-remembered catalog lists, from centuries of retelling that grew bolder with each pass. One chief librarian is said to have measured the Earth's circumference using nothing but a well and a shadow. So people reasoned outward. If they could weigh the planet with a stick, what else waited in the rooms we never got to see? That is the leap the myth lives on. Real brilliance becomes proof of impossible machines. The known justifies the imagined, and a legend told long enough stops asking to be checked. Here the tale stands tallest, and still not one thing you could ever pick up and weigh in your hand. It has never once been tested against a real object, but one is about to surface. In 1901, sponge divers took shelter from a storm off a bare Greek island. When the weather cleared, they dropped over the side to work the seabed below. One of them surfaced fast, shaken, babbling about a heap of bodies on the bottom. They were corpses of bronze and marble, arms and horses scattered across the sand. He had found a shipwreck, one no chart or story had ever recorded. Under the statues, half buried, lay a shapeless lump of corroded bronze no larger than a book. For months, it sat catalogued and shelved in an Athens museum with the rest of the hall. As it dried, the crust cracked. Inside, someone caught the clean edge of a gear tooth. Cut, deliberate. Then another tooth. Then the ghost of a dial emerging from the crust. This was the moment the old myth of a hidden library had been waiting for. The legend promised a hidden chamber under Alexandria, packed with machines too modern for their age, guarded from ordinary eyes. Here at last was a machine, real, wet from the sea, dug from a wreck no story had ever mentioned. Sponge divers had pulled a set of gears from the water. Nothing else that precise would appear again for 1,000 years. That is not a rumor. You can hold what remains of it today. So the two things sat side by side and refused to agree. The legend's chosen few versus a machine off a trade route. The evidence said something quieter. It was a device of 30 gears built to track the sun, moon, and planets. But it turned up not in a secret vault, only on a common trade route. It was advanced, and it was undeniably real. Yet it did not match the story people kept telling. The problem was no longer whether such machines could exist. One had just come up in a diver's net. The question now was sharper, and no legend could answer it. This corroded lump of bronze was about to be forced to say something a story never can. When exactly was it built? A physicist slides the corroded lump of bronze into a scanner and closes the shielded door. She has waited years for this machine time, booked months ahead and granted in one narrow window. The bronze pulled from the sea near Antikythera cannot be pried open. One wrong touch and the gears crumble to green dust. So she does not touch it. She sends X-rays through instead and lets the machine draw what her eyes cannot. The images return in slices, layer by layer, like photographing a sealed book without ever breaking its spine. A CT scan builds a picture in cross-sections, and inside those cross-sections, the teeth appear. She counts them by eye on a screen, one tooth at a time. Gears no one has looked at directly in 2,000 years. That count is the whole game. Every conclusion that follows rests on this one number. Count the teeth, and you have the ratio. The ratio tells you it was built to predict eclipses. Count them wrong, and the story collapses. Count them right, and a lump of rot becomes a calendar of the sky. But dating an object and trusting a story are two different tasks. So a second kind of scholar works the other side of the question. In a quiet archive, a historian checks the Mausion against the dull, honest paperwork empires leave behind them. This is the harder discipline and the less glamorous. A legend needs only to be repeated. A fact must survive a tax note, a rival's complaint, a letter with no reason to lie. The historian is looking for a real institution behind the myth of a secret one. She wants scholars who were housed, paid, and named, not shadows sworn to silence. That is how a record gets tested, not by whether it thrills us, but by whether indifferent sources agree. The teeth are counted now. The paperwork has been read. The method returned a date at last, the 2nd century before our era, and not the version the legend was selling. The verdict was never built to fit the legend. Watch it come apart piece by piece. Start with one man and the long shadow he cast beside a well in the noon sun. One of the library's own chief librarians, working around 240 years before our era, chased a single number, the size of the Earth. He had no ship, no satellite, only wells, sunlight, and geometry. He measured the shadow a stick through in one city while the sun stood straight down a well in another. From that gap, he calculated Earth's circumference, within a few percent of the true figure. No hidden chamber taught him that. A quiet mind in a summer noon did. Then walk into a workshop where an engineer built a hollow sphere that spun on steam. Water boiled, vapor pushed through two bent nozzles, and the sphere whirled. It was the same principle that would drive locomotives, centuries before anyone used it. He called it a toy. The future spun on his table, and the world just watched. A clay jar near Baghdad held a copper cylinder and an iron rod, and still divides researchers, because the evidence is thin. But this is the pattern the myth missed. The Mausion was no shadowy order of the chosen. It was a state-funded research institute, scholars housed and paid to think, the closest the ancient world came to a university. No conspiracy, real people, decades ahead of their time. Now the fire. In the war that brought Caesar to Alexandria, flames reached the shelves, and someone stood among the smoke, choosing what to carry out. The fire did not take everything. Some scrolls survived the smoke and the flames that night, but it opened the first crack in a pattern of loss that would not end for 4 more centuries. Who decides what a future is allowed to remember and what it must quietly lose? A retired teacher in a small town once told me about Alexandria's hidden chamber, and she told it beautifully. Each year, the room grew richer. First machine diagrams, then working engines, then a locked door with 3 secret keepers. She had read it somewhere, decades ago, and time had done the rest. She was not lying. She was the last link in a long chain of retelling, and every hand added one bright detail. That is the first machine that keeps the myth alive, and it has a name: survivorship bias. We only see what survived. The steam sphere Heron of Alexandria demonstrated in the 1st century of our era did survive, in words, and it dazzles us. But the failed drafts, the boring ledgers, the wrong guesses, those vanished without a trace. So the past looks like a highlight reel of genius, and we mistake the real for the whole archive. The loss feels more advanced than the record can honestly support, precisely because only the marvels made it through. The second machine is a story problem. A single dramatic fire is easy to picture and easy to blame. A slow unraveling across 4 centuries, funding cut here, a temple burned there, a collection quietly starving under indifferent rulers, is true. But no one can film it in one shot, so we keep the fire and drop the decades. And the third machine is a mirror. We hold up our phones, then project them backward, and the Antikythera device becomes impossible instead of just early. It was real. It was brilliant. It took over 1,000 years for anything comparable to appear again. But brilliant is not forbidden, and ancient is not magical. Here is why the myth still feels true even to careful people. Each one is a way of loving the past too much to look at it plainly. Understanding all of this explains why the story spreads. But it still leaves one thing untouched: how it actually ended. So here is how the fire really worked, and it is stranger than the legend that replaced it. The end was never a single night. It was a process that unspooled across centuries. First a blaze during Caesar's war, then a research institute slowly starved of its funding and its standing. A surviving remnant was carried to the Serapeum, a lesser-known temple library that outlived the great one. That temple stood until near the end of the 4th century of our era, and then it too was gone. No sealed chamber of forbidden machines. No cult of the chosen few guarding the future. Just an ordinary unraveling, nearly 4 centuries to finish its work. And now the hand returns, the one from the beginning, hovering over a diagram in a room beneath the halls. Only there is no room left, and no 2 piles to choose between. The archive is scattered now, its shelves emptied, its order gone for good. The last scroll comes loose, and the hand lets it fall. The sorting is over. The choice that seemed so heavy at the start turns out to have been made already. Quietly, by no one and by everyone, across 20 generations who each let a little more go. But here is the piece that honesty cannot close. We know the Antikythera mechanism was real. A calculator of gears so fine that nothing to match it appeared for over 1,000 years. We know Alexandria drew the minds who wrote geometry's textbook and measured the earth with shadows. We cannot know how many diagrams at that level passed through those back rooms and vanished for good. The masterpiece survived. Everything that led to it did not. That number has no floor and no ceiling. It could be small, or it could be staggering. Science can date what it holds, but it cannot count the pages that were never written down twice. So the question is yours now, the one the fire never really answered. If you had 1 hour in that archive before the fire, and could carry only what your 2 hands could hold, what would you choose to save?